Welcome. Today's story is one that history nearly buried, the unbelievable journey of an enslaved child who escaped bondage, rode west into danger, and by 1873 had become one of the most feared gunslingers in Texas. This isn't legend or movie fiction. This story is built from painstaking research, scattered records, and true historical accounts that took serious time and effort to uncover. As you listen, comment below where you're watching from, because this story traveled farther than most men ever did. And if you value deeply researched, true history storytelling like this, make sure to subscribe so this work doesn't disappear again. He was born into a world where freedom was not a right, but a distant, almost unimaginable idea. In the early decades of the 19th century, somewhere in the American South, his life began not with a name of his own choosing, but as property listed alongside livestock and tools. From his very first breath, the law did not see him as a child, it saw him as an asset. His fate was decided before he could walk, talk, or understand the meaning of chains that would soon define his existence. The plantation system he was born into was built on cruelty disguised as order. Enslaved children were introduced to labor at an age when they should have been learning to read or play. Hunger, fear, and punishment were constant teachers. He watched adults around him endure whippings, families torn apart by sale, and overseers who ruled with violence instead of mercy. These early sights carved lessons into his memory, lessons about survival, silence, and strength. As a child, he learned quickly that trust was dangerous and hope was costly. Even laughter had to be quiet, and dreams had to be hidden. Nights were often filled with whispered stories from elders, tales of distant lands where no master ruled, where a man could walk armed and free. Those stories, spoken softly under the threat of death, planted something powerful in his young mind, the idea that escape was possible. The American South at this time was tightening its grip on slavery, not loosening it. Laws became harsher, patrols more aggressive, and punishments more public. Enslaved children like him were watched closely, especially as they grew older and stronger. Every year that passed increased his value to his owner, and decreased his chances of ever leaving alive. Yet, instead of breaking him, this pressure hardened his resolve. By the time he reached adolescence, slavery had already shaped him into something dangerous to the system that held him. He had learned how power worked, how violence controlled men, and how fear could be used as a weapon. Though still a child in years, his mind had aged fast. And somewhere deep inside him, long before he ever touched a gun or rode west, the seed of rebellion had already taken root. From the moment he was strong enough to be useful, childhood ended. Under brutal ownership, every day began before sunrise and ended only when his body could no longer stand. He was assigned tasks meant to exhaust, not educate, hauling water, tending animals, carrying loads far heavier than his growing frame should have endured. Mistakes were not corrected, they were punished. Pain was the language his owners used to teach obedience. Violence was not random, it was systematic. Overseers enforced discipline through fear, making examples out of the weakest to keep everyone else in line. Whippings were public, slow, and meant to humiliate as much as injure. As a child, he learned to read moods quickly, the tone of a voice, the sound of boots on dirt, the look in a man's eyes because recognizing danger early could mean survival. This constant vigilance sharpened instincts that would later keep him alive in far deadlier places. Family offered little protection. Enslaved parents lived under the constant threat of separation, and children could be sold without warning. He saw brothers taken south, mothers collapsing in grief, and fathers forced to stand silent. Love existed, but it was fragile, always at risk of being ripped away. These losses taught him emotional restraint. Attachments made a person vulnerable, and vulnerability invited suffering. Despite the cruelty, ownership could never fully control his spirit. In stolen moments, behind barns in fields, or during late-night whispers, he absorbed lessons that weren't meant to be taught. Older enslaved men showed him how to move quietly, how to endure pain without showing it, and how to remember faces and directions. Survival knowledge was passed down not through books, but through scars and experience. By the time most children would have been innocent, he had already learned the true cost of power and helplessness. Brutal ownership did more than scar his body, it reshaped his understanding of the world. Authority, he realized, was maintained through force, and freedom would never be given, only taken. These early years did not break him. They forged a resolve that would one day push him beyond chains and into legend. The idea of escape did not come suddenly. It grew quietly, fed by years of suffering and whispered hope. As a child, he listened carefully when older enslaved workers spoke in coded language about routes, rivers, and distant places where slave catchers were scarce. Every story carried risk, but also possibility. By the time the thought of running became real, he already understood one truth. Clearly, staying meant a slow death, and leaving, even if it ended violently, was the only chance at life. His first escape attempt was not bold or heroic. It was desperate and imperfect. He chose a night when the plantation was unusually still, when exhaustion had dulled the overseer's vigilance. With no supplies and no map, he relied on instinct and fragments of knowledge. Follow the stars, avoid main roads, move through water to hide tracks. Every sound felt like a gunshot, every shadow like a man waiting to drag him back in chains. Fear became his constant companion. Hunger set in quickly, and his young body struggled against exposure and exhaustion. Slave patrols roamed the countryside, armed and legally empowered to kill. At times, he hid for hours without moving, mud pressed against his skin, breathing shallow enough to avoid detection. Each moment on the run taught him something new about silence, patience, and the cost of freedom. The attempt did not end as he had hoped. Whether betrayed, tracked, or simply overwhelmed by circumstance, he was eventually caught. The punishment was severe, designed not only to hurt him, but to erase the idea of escape from his mind. Public beatings, confinement, and humiliation followed. To his owners, this was correction. To him, it was confirmation escape was possible, and they feared it. Though his first attempt failed, it changed everything. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Fear no longer ruled him the way it once had. He had tasted movement without permission, air without commands, and the knowledge that the world beyond the plantation was real. That failed escape didn't end his dream, it refined it. The next time, he would be smarter, harder, and far more dangerous. After the fabled by his first escape, Patience became his greatest weapon. He waited, watched, and learned, studying routes, listening for changes brought by war and shifting laws. When the moment finally came, it was not driven by impulse but by calculation. This time he moved with purpose, slipping away during chaos created by a changing South, when authority was stretched thin and boundaries were easier to cross. He was still young, but survival had already made him older than his years. The journey west was brutal and unforgiving. He traveled mostly at night, avoiding towns and settlements where questions could cost him his life. Rivers were crossed silently, forests used as shelter, and abandoned trails became lifelines. Hunger was constant, forcing him to steal or scavenge when necessary. Every mile carried danger, not just from slave catchers, but from wild animals, hostile strangers, and the harsh land itself. As he moved farther from the plantations, the world began to change. Cotton fields gave way to open plains, and the rigid control of the South slowly loosened. In border regions and frontier settlements, identities were harder to verify, and a man could sometimes exist without explanation. He learned to blend in, working short jobs, trading labor for food, and never staying long enough to be remembered. Each stop taught him how to disappear. The Old West was no promised land. Law was thin. Justice was often decided by whoever carried the bigger gun, and survival favored the ruthless. But for the first time, freedom and danger existed side by side. He observed cowhands, drifters, and outlaws, how they carried themselves, how disputes were settled, and how respect was earned through strength and reputation. These lessons would shape the man he was becoming. By the time he reached Texas, the boy who had fled slavery was gone. In his place stood someone hardened by distance, loss, and relentless movement. The journey west did more than carry him away from chains. It delivered him into a world where power could be taken, not assigned. And in that lawless land, he would soon learn that a gun could speak louder than any past he was trying to outrun. Life on the frontier offered freedom, but it came at a brutal price. As a fugitive, he lived without protection, without identity, and without forgiveness for mistakes. Every new town carried opportunity and threat in equal measure. A wrong word, a curious glance, or a man asking too many questions could expose his past. Survival meant staying alert at all times and trusting no one completely. Work was temporary and exhausting. He labored as a ranch hand, trail helper, stable cleaner, any role that required muscle but few questions. Payment was often food, a place to sleep, or a few coins. He learned to move on before familiarity set in, understanding that roots made a man traceable. The frontier respected strength, not history, and he carefully built a reputation as someone reliable but distant. Racism and violence followed him west, even in places where the law was weak. Armed men enforced their own rules, and disputes were often settled with fists or firearms. He witnessed killings over land, cattle, and pride. These moments taught him that mercy was rare and hesitation was deadly. Observing others fall hardened his resolve and sharpened his instincts. As a fugitive, he also learned the power of anonymity. The frontier was filled with men running from something, failed pasts, criminal records, or lost wars. Among them, his silence became his shield. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing lessons about routes, weapons, and power dynamics. Every interaction became training for the life he was being pushed toward. This period shaped him in critical ways. Life on the frontier stripped away fear and replaced it with calculated readiness. He no longer thought like a runaway, he thought like a survivor in a violent world. And as the lines between outlaw, lawman, and hired gun blurred, it became clear that his path was narrowing toward one inevitable truth: to stay free, he would need to be feared. On the frontier, survival demanded more than strength. It demanded skill. It was here that he first began to truly understand the power of a gun. Firearms were everywhere in the Old West, carried openly and used often. At first, he observed from a distance, watching how men cleaned their weapons, how they stood when firing, and how quickly disputes turned deadly. A gun was not just a tool, it was authority in steel and powder. His early lessons came quietly. Older drifters and hardened cowhands showed him the basics, sometimes in exchange for labor, sometimes simply because teaching created loyalty. He learned how to load and fire, how to handle recoil, and how to keep a weapon from jamming at the worst possible moment. Practice happened away from towns, in open land where mistakes would not draw attention. Each shot built confidence, and each miss taught patience. Beyond the gun, he mastered survival skills essential to life on the move. He learned how to track others and how to avoid being tracked himself. Reading footprints, judging distance, finding water in dry land, and navigating by terrain became second nature. These skills were not optional, they were the difference between life and death. Hunger, weather, and human threats all demanded constant adaptation. Violence on the frontier was swift and unforgiving, and he learned that hesitation often meant death. He witnessed shootouts that ended in seconds and men who never had time to draw. These moments taught him the psychology of fear, how confidence could unsettle an opponent before the first shot was fired. He understood that reputation mattered as much as accuracy, and that standing firm could prevent a fight before it began. By the time he was fully armed, the transformation was complete. The enslaved child who once had no right to defend himself now carried the means to command respect in a lawless land. The gun did not make him reckless, it made him calculated. Combined with the survival skills he had earned through hardship, it positioned him for the next chapter of his life, where violence would no longer be a threat to fear, but a tool to control his fate. Texas in the years after the Civil War was a land caught between collapse and chaos. The old order had fallen, but nothing solid had replaced it. Law enforcement was thin, courts were unreliable, and vast stretches of land were governed by whoever had the will and the firepower to claim control. For someone like him, Texas was dangerous, but it was also full of opportunity. In a place where records were scarce and identities fluid, the past could be outrun. Reconstruction brought tension everywhere. Former Confederate soldiers, newly freed black men, opportunists, and outlaws all collided in towns struggling to survive. Violence was common, fueled by resentment, racism, and economic desperation. Armed groups enforced their own versions of justice, and killings were often ignored or quietly accepted. He quickly understood that Texas did not care where a man came from, only whether he could defend himself. For black men, freedom did not mean safety. The threat of racial violence was constant, and the law rarely offered protection. Vigilante groups and former slave catchers still operated, now under different names. He learned to move carefully, choosing when to be visible and when to vanish. Strength had to be balanced with restraint, because one wrong confrontation could draw a mob instead of a duel. At the same time, Texas was expanding fast. Cattle drives, railroads, and frontier towns created demand for tough men willing to work or fight. This growth allowed him to blend in, taking roles that put a gun in his hand and food on the table. Each job sharpened his reputation as someone capable and unafraid, even if few knew his true story. Texas after the Civil War shaped him as much as slavery once had, but in a different way. Here, power was not inherited, it was taken. The law was negotiable, fear was currency, and survival favored those who acted decisively. In this volatile landscape, he was no longer just surviving, he was adapting to a world where notoriety could be protection and violence could become a path to control his destiny. His entry into outlaw territory was not marked by a single decision, but by a gradual crossing of invisible lines. In post-war Texas, the boundary between lawful work and criminal survival was thin and constantly shifting. One job led to another, guarding cattle, riding with armed men, enforcing rough justice where courts didn't reach. Each step brought him closer to circles where the law was viewed as optional and violence as routine. Outlaw territory was less about geography and more about allegiance. These were regions where sheriffs feared to tread, where gangs, hired guns, and renegades controlled roads and resources. He learned quickly that neutrality was dangerous. To survive, a man had to choose sides or prove he was too costly to challenge. His reputation for calm under pressure and willingness to stand his ground made him valuable in these spaces. Crimes were often practical, rather than reckless. Cattle theft, protection work, ambushes, and debt enforcement kept money moving and power balanced. He observed how outlaws planned, communicated, and disappeared after a job. Precision mattered more than brutality. These lessons appealed to his disciplined nature, violence used strategically, not emotionally. Trust was rare and betrayal was common. Within outlaw groups, loyalty lasted only as long as advantage remained. He learned to rely primarily on himself, keeping his circle small and his intentions hidden. Every alliance was temporary, every agreement subject to change. This environment reinforced the survival instincts forged during slavery and flight. Expect nothing, prepare for everything. By stepping fully into outlaw territory, he accepted a life with no safety net. There would be no protection from the law, no mercy if captured. But there was power in this choice. In a world that had once owned him, he now moved as his own master, armed, feared, and increasingly known. This was the turning point where survival evolved into dominance, and his name began to circulate in whispers across Texas. Reputation in the Old West was built faster than it was earned, and, once established, it followed a man everywhere. His name began circulating through saloons, cattle camps, and outlaw hideouts, often carried by men who had never met him, but knew the results of crossing his path. Stories spread of confrontations that ended quickly, of fights where he never fired the first shot, but always fired the last. In a land where fear was currency, his reputation became his shield. What set him apart was not recklessness, but control. He did not drink himself into foolishness or draw a gun to impress others. When violence came, it was precise and final. Witnesses noted his calm, how his hands never shook, how his eyes never left his opponent. This composure unsettled enemies before a weapon was even drawn. Many men backed down simply because they recognized what standing against him would cost. Each deadly encounter added to the legend. Word traveled that he could outdraw younger men and outthink older ones. Some claimed he practiced constantly, others said he learned to kill back when survival depended on it. No matter the version, the outcome was the same: he survived, and others did not. In Texas, survival itself was proof of skill. His reputation also served as protection in a racially hostile world. Where laws failed and mobs formed easily, fear sometimes offered more safety than innocence ever could. People thought twice before provoking a man rumored to be lethal. He understood this and let the stories grow unchecked. Silence allowed exaggeration to do its work. By the early 1870s, he was no longer just a man with a gun. He was a known presence. Sheriffs were cautious, outlaws were respectful, and strangers watched him carefully. The enslaved child, who once had no voice, had become someone whose name alone could end a confrontation. And as 1873 approached, his reputation reached its peak, setting the stage for the most dangerous period of his life. By 1873, his name carried real weight across large parts of Texas. This was the year when whispers turned into warnings and stories hardened into accepted truth. He was no longer just reacting to danger. Danger was seeking him out. Men wanted to test his reputation, to be the one who could say they faced him and lived. In the violent culture of the Old West, notoriety was both a weapon and a target. This period was marked by constant tension. Every town he entered, every trail he rode, came with eyes watching and hands resting near holsters. Lawmen debated whether he was worth the risk, while outlaws weighed whether he could be an ally or a threat. He understood that hesitation could invite attack, so he carried himself with absolute certainty, calm, deliberate, and always prepared. Confidence in 1873 Texas was a form of armor. Several confrontations during this year cemented his status. Some ended in bloodshed, others in silent standoffs where one look was enough to settle the matter. These moments rarely made newspapers, but they spread quickly by word of mouth. Around campfires and saloon tables, his actions were retold, often exaggerated, turning him into a figure larger than life. Truth and myth blended until they were inseparable. Despite the fame, isolation grew. Notoriety closed as many doors as it opened. Trust became impossible. Friendships dangerous. Every interaction carried the risk of betrayal or ambush. He learned to travel alone more often, relying on reputation rather than companionship. Freedom remained his greatest prize, but it came with relentless pressure. By the end of 1873, he stood at the height of his power and the edge of his fate. He had risen from slavery to command fear in one of the harshest landscapes in America. Yet peak notoriety was never a resting place, it was a turning point. From here, the road could only lead to legend, disappearance, or death. When his violent years finally faded, his name did not pass into clean history. It slipped into shadows. Unlike famous gunslingers whose stories were preserved in newspapers and dime novels, his legacy was quietly erased. Race, lawlessness, and the absence of official records worked together to bury his existence. In death or disappearance, there were no monuments, no confirmed graves, and no clear ending, only silence. Much of what survived lived in fragments. Oral histories, local rumors, and scattered court documents hinted at a man whose life refused to fit neatly into the narratives of the Old West. His story was often distorted, credited to others, or stripped of its origins. An enslaved child becoming a feared gunslinger challenged comfortable versions of history, and so his truth was allowed to fade. Decades passed before historians began asking harder questions. Why were certain names remembered while others vanished? Why did frontier violence get romanticized for some and erased for others? By tracing overlooked records, land disputes, and witness accounts, researchers slowly pieced together his path. What emerged was not myth, but a deeply human story of survival, resistance, and transformation. Rediscovering his legacy reshaped how the Old West itself is understood. It revealed that gunslingers were not only outlaws or heroes, but sometimes former victims of systems that left them no other path. His life exposed the brutal intersections of slavery, freedom, race, and violence in post-Civil War America. Today, his story stands as a correction to history, not just an addition. He was not born a legend, he was forced into one by circumstance. Remembering him is more than storytelling. It is an act of restoring truth to a past that tried to forget him.